Well, bright good morning to everybody, and thank you for joining us for Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. I'd appreciate if you would all sign in to the chat box and put the number of people who are watching the program from your site. This is really helpful to us to keep track of how many people from which counties. So if you put your county and the number of people from your site, then we can tally all that up and be able to share with our presenters and as well as others who are interested in how many people we're reaching. So type your name, your county, the number of people at your site. Be sure you run the audio setup wizard, so go up to Tools, Audio Setup to make sure that you have your mic working so that when you're ready to ask a question or make a comment, we'll be able to hear you. Remember that you have to turn your microphone on. Just under the big black box in the upper left corner, there's a button that says Talk. So you need to turn that button on when you're ready to talk, and I appreciate you're leaving it off when you're not talking so we don't get any background noise or feedback. So thanks. And agents, you can register for continuing education credit. My name is Lucy Bradley. I'm the NC State Urban Horticulture and Extension Master Gardener Specialist. I'm delighted to be your host this morning. And I'm also delighted that Lee J. Temple is here as Instructional Specialist and Technology Guru. Welcome, Lee J.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? I'm assuming you're all saying, wonderful, wonderful. What I want to do is give an overview of the Collaborate system. For those of you who are new, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see something that looks like what's on the whiteboard. And at the very top, as Lucy said, you have the talk button if you wish to talk. Again, we ask that you keep that off if you are not talking. Directly below that, we have some icons that will help you interact with the presenters. One in particular is the polling button, and I have put a big box around it. What I'd like for you to do is to click on that. It's a little checkbox, and underneath, click the green check to let me know that you see this button and that you're able to interact with us. Good, getting check marks coming in, that's awesome. This checkbox might turn to a letter if you're asked a multiple choice question, so just keep that in mind. It'll be in the exact same place. To interact with the whiteboard, I'm going to ask you to use this little starburst or sun icon on the next slide, so you'll know where that is. Again, it has a purple box around it. And if you have any questions, you can type in the chat box, and one of the moderators will get back to you. Believe that's all for the overview. If you have technical questions as well as questions about the content, be sure to type them in the chat box. What I'd like for you to do now is to click on that starburst icon and click where you are in North Carolina. Good deal. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Lucy. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you, Lee J. We got a great program lined up for you today. Our featured speaker is Dr. Jeanine Davis talking about organic gardening. And we have Matt Bertone with Entomology and Mike Munster with diseases, and of course, Mark Blevins with NCSU plants. Delighted to welcome Dr. Jeanine Davis to our program. Jeanine is Extension Specialist based out of our Flint River office, Flint Mills office right outside of Asheville. Her expertise is in sustainable organic production systems, and she works with herbs, vegetables, and a whole slew of other specialty crops. So, Jeanine, welcome.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So what I've put together today is a PowerPoint presentation that any of you can use in your educational programming, and we'll just go through it slide by slide. And I hope it's helpful, and just let me know afterwards if we need to make any additions or deletions from the program for your use. I tried to use pictures that we've had from our own program and from some of my own gardens, but as most of us do, I went to the internet to find a couple of pictures to illustrate points, and just want to let you know that all of those are identified on these pictures when they're borrowed, and to please carry those credits along with them. And plus, oftentimes, those are interesting sites to visit also. Just a little bit more about me. I have personally been gardening organically for over 40 years. Kind of amazed me when I wrote that down the other day. We do run a small farm ourselves and run a market garden that we follow the National Organic Program standards on. However, we're not certified organic because our customers don't require us to do so. I'm a founding member of the Organic Growers School here in Western North Carolina, which is turning out to more and more be a wonderful resource not only for organic farmers, but also for organic gardeners. Some of our board members just finished up a new gardening series, and we fill that class every time we offer it now. And then I've also been an organic researcher and extension specialist here at NC State for 28 years. And just about 5 years ago, we instituted an organic research unit at the Waynesville Research Station. And I encourage you to try to come out and visit us there, particularly at our field days, and see what kind of work we have going on there. So why all the interest in organic gardening? And in my 28 years here at NC State, I see this go in waves of interest, and we are definitely on one of those increasing waves at the present time. And I think this is being driven by a number of things that are happening within our communities and on the media. Part of it is we all have a desire to be healthier. We're being encouraged to eat more vegetables and get more exercise, and of course gardening helps do that. I think a lot of it is being driven by people trying to reduce their costs at the grocery store. The price of food is increasing monthly, and growing a garden, as we all know, is a good way to save money. And the next is a rather controversial issue. That's pesticide and GMO use. But whether we agree that that's a problem or it's not a problem, the reality is that a lot of people want to reduce their exposure to pesticides and GMOs, and by maintaining their own gardens, they have that control, which is a lot of having a garden. Is you get to live more sustainably, you can be self-sufficient, it puts you in a little bit more control of your lives. And some people are kind of closet preppers. They want to know that they could provide for themselves if something disastrous actually happens. What I'm finding presently is many of the people who are interested in organic gardening right now are first-time gardeners. They have never had a garden before in their lives. I'm finding that we have now got 1 and 2 generations of people that didn't have gardeners. That's hard for me to imagine. I come from a family of generations that even if you just had a small garden, you grew some of your food. But there's people now that have no experience whatsoever, and many of them are reporting to me that their desire to have a garden is coming through their children, that their children are being exposed to gardening at school, that there are nonprofits coming into the school and helping them start school gardens, and the children are also going out on field trips to various farms and learning about where their food comes from and what nutritious food is. So as a result, I'm finding that as I'm training people about organic gardening, I'm having to do a lot more than just teaching the organic aspects. We're starting from ground zero with how do you do a garden. And so I've put this PowerPoint together with that in mind. So how do we explain what organic gardening is and keep it simple? And I think probably the easiest way to do this is just talk about organic gardening as being a whole systems approach to growing our food as much in harmony with nature as we can, which means there's also a little bit of give and take. We're not trying to control every little thing that happens in that garden. We're willing to give a little to the insects, give a little to the diseases. This can be hard for some people who have done a very chemical controlled kind of gardening, particularly with their tomatoes. But you know, that's more of our approach. Of course, organic gardening starts all with the soil, and we spend a lot of our efforts in organic gardening at building up a healthy soil, working in a lot of organic matter, and keeping in mind that we're always trying to replenish that system. So it's not so much just putting in crops and then removing those crops and all of the plant parts at the end of the season and starting all over again. We always want to consider what we're putting back into that soil. A good organic garden also involves growing what's appropriate for your region, not trying to produce crops that really don't grow well in your area. You grow what you can there. And I'm not saying you can never do anything exotic, and that's always kind of fun to do, but the majority of your garden should be based around what's appropriate for your location. And of course, organic gardening does not include the use of synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, but I do like to remind people that we do use fertilizers and we do use pesticides, although some people do not like to use that name, pesticides, for organic products they use, but of course if they're killing insects and diseases, they are indeed pesticides. Probably the greatest key to having a successful organic garden is in the planning, and more so than it is with doing a more conventional kind of garden. Because with organic garden, as you're building that soil, you have to think long term. You need to think about crop rotations, which are at a minimum 3 to 4 years in a rotation. So the planning is very, very important, and I'll stress this several times. And people that I know are successful organic gardeners usually have great notebooks of information. And matter of fact, my husband just showed me his last night and how he's had to go on to start a second notebook because he had so many years in the first one. So encouraging people to write things down, to either use a program online that they can get, or an Excel-based program, or just a good old-fashioned notebook. It doesn't matter how you do it, just that you record everything, that you make lists of what you want to grow, that you draw a plan of your garden and position out where things will be. You know, are you going to grow in traditional beds so that you can run a tiller or a hoe easily down those roads? Are you going to do beds or raised beds, and how are you going to position those? Or are you going to grow in blocks? Our gardens for many years we had done, they were square gardens, and we would do them in quads, so I could easily do a 4-year rotation on that garden. Get people to think about diversity and companion planting. So if you've got large gardens, not doing things in great big giant blocks, but breaking them up so you have different species of plants growing next to each other. And another point I tried to make, particularly to new gardens, is gardening should be an enjoyable activity. It should be fun. It should be something that you do to relax, to spend time with family or friends doing this activity. And many people, when they start a garden, they're really serious about it, and they read all the books and they plan these giant gardens, and it's fun in the beginning, but then as the season progresses and the weeds start getting out of hand, it's no longer fun. So I encourage people, especially new gardeners, to make the garden a very reasonable size and explain that a garden can be very tiny. You could have a garden that's 4 feet by 5 feet and grow a lot of food in that, and yet that's a reasonable size that you can keep looking wonderful the whole growing season and feel very proud of. So I think starting out with a realistic plan of what you can do, especially in your early years, is very important. I encourage people to grow what they like to eat, what they like to grow. Sometimes we get carried away with the catalogs or at the plant sales, and we come home with things that we don't really like. I personally have done this with Swiss chard. The Swiss chard in all the different colors are beautiful, but I don't like it. So I've had that there, and then I go through this guilt trip about why that's growing there. Now I grow for market, and so I can cut it and sell it to somebody else. But, you know, why was I growing Swiss chard unless I wanted to look at it as an ornamental? Be prepared to share a little bit with the insects, maybe some with the rabbits and the groundhogs. That's just part of organic gardening, and the sooner we come to accept that, the easier it is to live with a little bit of that damage and loss that's just natural with a garden where you can't control every little thing. And just keep in mind that your garden doesn't have to look like a picture out of a magazine. Other than taking notes, probably the most important thing to have a successful garden is choosing the perfect location. And this can be a serious problem for many people who really don't have a good site for their gardens, and as a result, all season long they're fighting with disease issues, whether it's Phytophthora root rot or fungal foliar diseases, because their site just isn't ideal. So people should be looking for a very sunny location where they get 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight every day. And if they don't have that, if they're living in the middle of the woods, encourage them to farm or garden with somebody else, a neighbor, or to use a community garden so that they can actually be successful and not have a bunch of spindly, sick plants. The garden should be convenient to access. If it's in your yard, it should be something you can walk out to and be able to work in a few minutes every day after work without it being a big chore. Hopefully you've got a site that's already fertile. If not, we can change the soil through our organic practices. But what is important is that it be well drained. If you don't have a well-drained site, but you've got the sunlight and you want to garden there, we can modify this by building raised beds. And that would be a topic for a whole nother talk. But I know many people who have a whole series of raised beds because they really don't have a good soil site to grow in. You need to be sure to have ready access to good water, and if you don't have a hose bib there, to get one installed, or by using above ground lay flat and other materials, get water out to where you can irrigate that garden easily. It's best to pick a site that's not heavily infested with weeds that are difficult to control. Initially, if you do have that problem, that's something we want to get on top of initially. And there are some people that will go and do a one-time spray with Roundup to get started. Some people consider that cheating, but some go, I'm going to start with a clean slate and build on there. Others will choose to use something like pigs to root out maybe a Johnson grass problem initially. And then make sure there's room for expansion, either immediately adjacent to the site that you're growing at now, or that you can just add on to it. For example, at my place, we put our squash in a whole separate area because we tend to grow heirloom squash that just really spread out widely and would take over too much of our regular garden area. Again, soil is the critical factor with an organic garden, and we can't come back to that too much, that it's all in the soil. That's what the whole philosophy of organic gardening is based on. And ideally, if someone's going to do an organic garden, they should start planting the fall before. Get your soil tested just like you would for any other garden. Get rid of the big weeds, the rocks, what other obstructions are there. And you want to turn that soil about 10 to 12 inches deep. This can be done with a rototiller like you see in the top picture, or a lot of organic gardeners like to do everything by hand, and a common tool to use is a broad fork. Personally, I last about 10 minutes with a broad fork. I have never had the kind of soil that I could effectively use a broad fork on, but lots of people really love that tool. There are organic gardeners that don't till, but initially, if you're first getting a garden started, at least for the first year or two, you'll probably want to use this practice. Then later on, you could go on to using a no-till method or planting in straw bales or one of these other alternative type of methods. Then when the soil test results are back, of course, you're going to incorporate any needed amendments, any lime or organic fertilizers, but mostly working in good compost. All of us try to put as much organic matter back into the soil as we possibly can. And then ideally, you're going to grow a cover crop until spring. With organic gardens, as much as we can, we try to keep something green and living on that soil, unless we're dealing with some very specific insect or weed problem, which keeping it fallow and churning the soil several times during the winter might be helpful. We always try to keep a cover on the soil. But in the real world, most of us don't start planting a garden until the springtime. So we don't start the fall before, and so we don't grow that cover crop. And that's okay. We just work that in when we come into next fall, that we go ahead and plant that cover crop. You can start fresh right now with an organic garden. So in addition to adding a lot of organic matter to that soil, we want to think about keeping the soil alive. And I encourage people to read about things like the food web. The soil food web is a term that Dr. Elaine Ingham, formerly of Oregon State University, really made popular. And she did a great job of showing people in microscopes all the life in their soil and how by incorporating a lot of compost and green manure, we can encourage more life in the soil. I love this little picture here from Mother Earth News of people that let their ducks and chickens and such into their garden, maybe in the spring and the fall. They will eat a lot of weeds, they'll eat insects, and of course they add their own manure to the gardens. But remind people that they do have to be careful with the raw manure, so you want to leave at least 130 days between the time that you have an animal like this directly in your garden and you harvest something from that soil. Little more caution about the manure and compost, because this is a problem we keep running into. I'm dealing with some of these issues right now in Transylvania County, and this is about this herbicide carryover that we're finding coming through manure, hay, compost, and even grass clippings. We do have this publication, NC State publication on this, on herbicide carryover, and I just updated this about a month or two ago. These are very persistent herbicides that are often used on hay fields. The farmer thinks they're being very sustainable because they only have to make that spray application once. But that hay is harvested, it's consumed by the horses or the cattle, goes through their manure, gets made into compost, and that compost is still an herbicide. And those herbicide effects, if that compost or manure gets worked into the soil, we still see those effects sometimes 3 and 4 years after application. So people need to ask questions about their manure. The manure on my farm is very popular among the gardens in our area because this is something we're very careful about, and we ask our hay producers where they got their, how they treat their hay, what herbicides they use. So this is something people need to be very cautious about. There are many other types of organic fertilizers, the green manures I keep mentioning, and of course that's where you grow a cover crop and turn that in. There are other ways of doing cover cropping, but this is probably one of the most popular ways that our organic gardeners use it. There are also packaged fertilizers that people can apply, and sometimes this is necessary for you to meet certain requirements that your soil test shows that you are deficient on. I encourage people to look for the OMRI label, and that's the Organic Materials Review Institute, and I will show you a picture, a close-up of that logo in a little bit later. And then people need to keep in mind that most all organic fertilizers, whether it's compost or even a packaged product, is a slow-release form of fertilizer. We don't have very many quick-release organic fertilizers, so you have to plan accordingly and have what you need in that soil, because we don't usually have a good way to meet immediate needs, particularly for nitrogen. And then for the people building their first garden, this is when you add all the non-plant stuff. So this is when you put up a fence with a gate to keep out the deer and rabbits and dogs and such. And this is when you build your raised beds, which you can do one or two at a time. This is where you add your trellises, arbors, or any other kind of support systems. And I have found for deer control, scattering these in various places in our garden, adding these vertical distractions, often will prevent deer from jumping into that garden because, of course, they'll go over a 4 or 5 foot fence. And then this is where you plan your irrigation systems, and I encourage people to use a drip irrigation system, not just for water conservation, but to help with weed control by just putting water where it's needed. And I do show a picture here with the plastic. Yes, plastic mulches can be used in organic systems, although they need to be removed every year, and of course we have the disposal issue. Right now is when people are obtaining their seeds and plants. We have lots of spring plant sales going on, which is a great place for people to go and buy their plants and seeds from people that they can talk to about the various characteristics of those varieties. I think you're going to find with your organic gardeners that there's a great deal of interest in heirlooms. Many people believe that heirlooms are superior to our hybrids and new plants that are out there, and this is a good talking point for us to teach people, why we do plant improvement. For example, our tomato breeder here, Delete Panthy, is creating heirloom type hybrid tomatoes that have the funky colors and shapes and good taste of the heirloom tomatoes, but then have the disease resistance that makes them much more pleasant for us to grow and ensure as a crop, so kind of giving us the benefit of both worlds. There is a big seed saving effort going on across the nation, so a lot of people are looking for open pollinated varieties to grow, and we often with new gardeners have to spend a good deal of time explaining the difference between open pollinated seeds and hybrids and why you can't collect seeds from your hybrids. So I encourage people to look for plants and varieties that are adapted to their region, to talk to other gardeners. Again, going to these events is a good way to find varieties that do really well in your area. And to remind people that if they want to grow their own transplants, that they probably needed to be thinking about that back in February. So many new gardeners have to buy their own transplants initially just because, they didn't plan far enough in advance. Again, just a little bit more about the difference of choosing the appropriate plants. This is some of the work that we're doing in Waynesville with our tomato breeders, and you can see the tomatoes on the left have that late blight resistance bred into them, where the ones on the right did not. And then, again, encouraging people to just grow plants that they're going to be successful with, like lettuce and potatoes and corn and peppers. And you want to make that first gardening experience with people to be very positive. So have them grow things that they're probably going to be successful with. Of course, people can produce their own transplants. This is always something fun to do, particularly if there's children there. And you can do a small number of these in a house under fluorescent lights or in a sunny window. Others have a greenhouse that they can produce in a small greenhouse. Encourage people to get an organic potting mix, a true organic potting mix, and sometimes that requires going to a specialty store to buy that. One that comes to mind for me is Fifth Season, which has a store in Asheville, and I know they have one in Greensboro. And I use like a McEnroe potting mix, but there are several others that are good organic mixes. Remember that those mixes don't have a lot of fertilizer action in them, so we often have to do some light feeding, maybe with a fish emulsion type product. And remind people they need to harden their plants off before setting them out in the garden. When we're working with small gardens in particular, I remind people that they can do a succession of plantings so they can get more out of that space. So for example, when their spring peas are done, maybe they're going to plant cucumbers afterwards. Or when their garlic comes out in midsummer, that's a good place to put the fall broccoli. Reminding people about following those good plant rotations where you're planting plants from different families. So you're not following tomatoes and potatoes, but you're going from different families. And consider intercropping. Sometimes this is a little complicated for someone their first year with gardening, but definitely a good way to use space as they become more experienced. And probably a good way to start with this is when people plant their fall broccoli to encourage them to sow clover seed around those plants. So as that broccoli matures, that cover crop is becoming established. So when the broccoli's done, they've already got their winter cover crop in that area planted for the winter. So deciding when is the right time to put out your transplants and sow your seeds is really important. I know here in the mountains we have now had frosts the past couple of weeks. And, you know, I know people that went, early gardeners, they went and they put those tomato plants out already, and so they're going back to buy more plants, which is really great for the farmers selling transplants, but very discouraging for people to keep replanting. So encourage people to look at the calendars, and we've got many of these within our system, to know when's the right time to put things out. Remind them about things like planting squash early, so their summer squashes, to avoid some of the insects and virus problems that they might run into later in the season. You know, teaching them about lettuce and growing those during the cooler season. So remember, you're working with new gardeners. The spacing and pruning of plants with organic gardens, because we don't have much in the way of herbicides to use, we often use the plants to provide the shade to shade out the weeds. With some plants this works really well, but other plants that are more prone to particularly the foliar fungal diseases such as tomatoes, we want to space them and prune them to allow for a lot of really good air movement around them. Probably one of the toughest things for people to get used to in an organic garden is you're going to have some damage. And we actually encourage this a bit because we have to, if we want to have predator insects out there to help control the bad insects, you've got to have some food around there for those predators. So we need to have a balance of the good and the bad guys out there. And that takes a little getting used to, learning how much damage you can go ahead and sustain without damaging your crop. Flea beetles on some crops, on some of my brassicas, I can handle it. With eggplants, I now know that I have to use a row cover or they'll do so much damage that I lose the crop. So to encourage these good insects to be there, we use a practice that we call farmscaping, and this is actually something now that we're researching on a farm scale, as you can see that picture on the right. And that's providing plants to provide homes for our pollinators and our predator insects. So they're usually flowers and herbs, so they make an organic garden look very beautiful. And you do have to be a little careful that you don't attract more pests. I get this warning. I've not seen it actually happen yet, but standard plants to use, buckwheat is a wonderful one. Fennel, clovers, coriander, radishes, and even some rye and oats. We tend to use a lot of nasturtiums, marigolds. I like anise hyssop and some of the umbel flowers to attract various predator insects and give them a place to live. I mentioned the row covers, and here is us putting row covers on some of our organic broccoli at the organic unit in Waynesville, and we often will use this for eggplant and things like our broccolis to control or keep out some of those insects that will affect particularly those young plants. Now this is where your crop rotations come in to be really important again, because some of these insects overwinter in the soil. So if you plant a host plant to that insect twice in the same place, you could just be making this nice little house for those insects to come up, and the plants they want to eat are right there. So again, knowing your insects, what their host plants are, and doing proper crop rotations to avoid that can be quite successful, and we've done really well with the row covers. Other insect controls, the main one is producing the healthiest plants you can. And a mistake that I see some people make initially is they over-fertilize their plants, and we have found that that can actually be stressful. And if those plants are really growing fast, they're sometimes more attractive to the insects. I don't know why, but that is something that we've observed. Again, timing of your planting can avoid some problems, but encouraging people to learn about their insects and be able to tell the good ones from the bad ones is really important, and particularly the larval stages. A lot of new organic gardeners will be out there destroying all of the ladybug eggs and larval forms they find because they look weird and they don't know what they are. Of course, at times we do need to get out there and do some spraying if things get out of hand, but this needs to be done judiciously because most of our organic insecticides are not selective and they're going to kill the good bugs along with the bad bugs. Weed control is the biggest problem that we have, hands down, in an organic garden. There's all kinds of different methods that people use. Some are much more successful than others depending on where you're located. A popular one right now is to spread cardboard down, pin it down with landscape pins, and cover it with mulch. Lots of people use a straw mulch, but it has to be a very clean mulch, not full of seeds. Keeping the area clean with a hoe. I mean, there's times in my own gardens that I'll just say, this season I'm going to do a clean culture, I'm going to have straight rows, and just come home in the afternoon and run a good sharp hoe down the road. Let's see, we have a question here. Do we have a chart that shows insects and their host plants for typical garden plants? There are some of those out there. I'll have to go look and see if I can find one of those for you. Other people are planting just grass strips between their rows and then just using their weed eater or their lawnmower to keep that controlled. I mentioned the black plastic that some folks use. Something else that's popular is using landscape fabric or silt fencing, which is a cheaper method of doing that and convenient widths. And that's woven polypropylene fabric. So that allows the soil to breathe. It lets water move through, and you can use it year after year. So even some of our big certified organic farmers go ahead and use the silt fencing. And then this lower picture is showing one of our local gardens using pigs. They had a Johnson grass problem that they absolutely could not get on top of, and so they brought in some pigs that they raised that year and put them in that area and completely rooted out that problem. Of course, they couldn't garden in that area that year. Disease control with some of our plants, particularly with tomatoes, this is an issue. Trying to grow organic tomatoes outside is one of the toughest things we're trying to do in North Carolina. So disease-resistant plants are the first line of defense, and what I would encourage any first-time organic grower who wants to grow tomatoes to use is Mountain Magic. And that is a variety that Dr. Randy Gardner bred here at NC State. It is a smallish tomato, but it has good late blight and early blight resistance, and it is a wonderful tasting tomato. So that came out of that heirloom type hybrid program. Also trying to keep your foliage as dry as possible, so having good air circulation and doing drip irrigation helps. Practicing long crop rotations, and of course learning how to identify diseases so you can do control pretty early on. I encourage people growing things like tomatoes and cucurbits to go ahead and find one of the late blight and downy mildew forecasting sites and monitor that so that when conditions are ripe for these conditions, they can start taking preventative actions. Because particularly organically, once you get those diseases started, there's not going to be anything really that you can do about it. However, we have had some success with late blight, for example, using copper or Serenade and products like that. Again, these are some of these products. There are more and more on the market and available to home gardeners every year. And I think people should be aware that these products are being used by many of our conventional farmers now too, because they tend to be very safe for the worker to use, and they have either short or no reentry periods and very short pre-harvest wait times before a crop can be harvested and consumed. So they're popular among a lot of growers. However, they still can be expensive.
Jeanine,
you don't want to rely on them all the time.
Do you have a chart that shows insects and the host plants that are for typical garden plants?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mentioned that just briefly, that I know those charts are available, and I don't have one, and I can't think of one right offhand, but I will go ahead and try to track one of those down. And somebody does have a chart like that. I just have to remember if it was really right for North Carolina. Thank you, Lizzie. Then remembering about preventing the spread of disease. This is something that a lot of our gardeners don't think of. Is, they'll go and work in an area that's got a sick plant, maybe remove it from the garden, but then not think about cleaning their shoes or their tools or their hands before they move into another area. So these are the kind of precautions that we need to take more in organic gardens than we even do in a conventional garden, because there is just so few things that we can do to control a problem once it gets started. Again, this is where I encourage writing things down, taking notes, taking photos throughout the season so we can really learn what strategies worked best in our garden, what varieties worked the best, taking notes from visiting other people's gardens. This is just really a critical point with organic gardening, much more so than with a conventional garden. Again, I want to mention the seed saving because so many people are doing that now. So reminding people about what crops we need to practice some isolation on and how to do this properly. And there are some really good resources on seed saving now. Carolina Farm Stewardship had a program on this years ago, and you can go into their resource section on carolinafarmstewards.org and find some of that. And we also have some new projects starting right now to teach people to save seeds. And actually, we're going to see more seed production going on in our region because of people looking for things that are really well adapted to our region. And then to remind people that the season isn't over at that first frost. Once the garden has been cleaned out and you've turned under the plant debris, you plant your garlic in a fresh new spot. Remind people that that garlic, which everybody's garden should have garlic, it's just so easy to produce and so good for you. You put that in a fresh area, and then you get your cover crop sown so that garden is ready for the next year. And this is a hard point to get people to do because by then they're tired, they've been gardening all season, but It's really not done until you have those cover crops sown. And I find that organic gardening is much like good cooking. It's best done with others and learned from others. So we have so many opportunities all across North Carolina for gardeners to get together. There are workshops and conferences, and there's nonprofits running little programs all over the place where people can come together for an evening or a weekend and share and see demonstrations of what's going on. And this is so valuable for new people to get out there and talk with other people that are doing it and ask those questions, learn how to identify insect and diseases right there with the plants in front of them. So some really good resources that I wanted to point out, which interestingly we don't have that many good organic gardening resources within our land grant system yet, at least not that I can find that are up to date and I think really helpful. But we're fortunate that there are others out there doing that. Extension's very involved in Organic Growers School. I've been on that board forever. We've got really good material starting to come out of that program and with a section just for gardeners. And we have a spring event that brings in thousands of people every year that lets you learn from the people that are actually doing it. So events like that are really good. Mother Earth News has so much information for the beginning gardener, and if people have never attended one of their fairs, their Mother Earth News fairs, we just had one in Asheville a few weeks ago, what a great place to learn from a lot of experts and to get every kind of tool, seed, and product you could possibly want. We've got some really good seed companies out there that are producing local seeds and heirloom and open pollinated seeds, such as Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, and that company also has a good library of resources and are very local and very approachable to answer questions. And then I recently found this website, sustainablemarketfarming.com, which is associated with that book that you see there with that same name, which also has some really good information, and Pam does a delightful little blog there. This book, I always get asked by people, what's a book with a lot of good pictures that's aimed at the home gardener? And Rodale has always had one of the best pest books out there. I've got them from 40 years back. I buy one of these about once every 10 years, and I believe that this is the latest version out there. Elliot Coleman is kind of the granddaddy of organic gardening, and he has I think this is his latest book, The Four-Season Harvest, which has a lot of the good principles of organic gardening in a really easy to understand way in there. I've mentioned the Sustainable Market Farming, and then Ira Wallace of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange recently released this book on vegetable gardening in the Southeast. So it's, I think, the first book that's really geared particularly for us, and of course it's all on organics. And I see that the new, we have in the chat box here, it says the new Extension Gardener Handbook will have a chapter on organic gardening, and that's great because like I said, when I went looking for our kind of in-house resources, I was kind of embarrassed to see that we didn't really have very much to offer, and some from other states was really, really outdated. So with that, I would like to open this up to some discussion if we have time for that.
Absolutely.
Lucy?
Good time for a couple of questions. You're welcome to. You guys are welcome to
nobody with any questions or comments?
Ask them out loud. Don't forget to push the talk button, or you can put them in the chat. We'll wait just a second and give you a chance to go. I see. Can BT be used in organic?
I see it most certainly can. And BT, we've got to be careful about how we use it because there is some resistance developing to that. That's the BT products. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. Dipel is probably the most well-known brand of that. But we're finding that the BT products are still working really well, particularly on our brassicas for for controlling the various worms that we get there? Good question.
Let's see, I see Pitt County has got a question.
So, is there a reference that easily lays out a calendar timeline for insects and diseases? Lucy, don't we have one like that somewhere in our system?
I think we have room for improvement on what we have that lays out the calendar of what to expect and when. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I think I remember a specialist putting kind of a half-hearted effort into that a few years ago. That would be a great thing, I think, for us to get a small grant to
I think that's
do one with some good pictures.
A wonderful suggestion.
Good idea. Another question on organic control of stink bugs. There is a multi-state federally funded project working on that right now. So I hope they're coming up with some answers. And Barbara Shue, are you saying that we've actually got some good control methods out there?
No, sorry, I realized after I wrote that you would know what that was in reference to. That's about in reference to a chart with seasonality of some pests. Although that's probably landscape pests.
Yeah, it's actually an ornamental one. But that's a great idea for vegetables, and I'd like to help when the time comes, provide photos and kind of tweak what a good calendar will be, because I'd like to know that better too.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, the stink bug issue, Jim Walgenbach here and a couple others on campus are working on this federal project, and the last I talked to Jim Walgenbach, we don't really have good organic controls for the stink bugs yet. They are a problem.
Squish them.
Exactly.
If the garden is small enough, you can squish them, but they don't smell very good.
Yeah, and also just make sure that you're killing the plant-feeding ones and not the predators, because there are predatory stink bugs. So.
Yeah, that identification of the insects with organic gardeners is so very, very important, because we have so many people out there destroying all their predators because they just think any bug's a bad bug. So teaching people that is super important.
Okay, and last question on cover crops, Jeanine.
What cover crops is easy to turn in a small space, and is leaf mulch a good recommendation as an alternative? Cover crops, I like to use a mix, so I'm often doing clovers along with grasses. A lot of us like to use buckwheat because that's so attractive to so many of our predatory insects. We find those to be pretty simple. Yes, any kind of organic matter, like using leaf mulches or straw or stuff like that, is really good. It's what do people have access to, and what isn't going to bring a lot of weed seeds in with it that's going to work.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeanine. We greatly appreciate your joining us today. We really appreciate your preparing the PowerPoint for Extension Master Gardener volunteers to use when they're teaching about organic gardening and modeling how best to do that. So thank you. And congratulations on your first Collaborate presentation.
Thanks so much.
All right. Next up is the soon-to-be Dr. Mark Blevins, Brunswick County Director and our plant guy.
Hey, thanks
Mark,
so much,
welcome.
Lucy. All right. Welcome, one and all, to the Ralston's Hardy Viburnum and Bailey Circus. Direct your eyes to the center ring where this dwarf performs wonders throughout the year. Dense clusters of April flowers yield a spectacular display of red fruits that turn to black and are absolutely loved by those winged wonders. No, not our acrobats, just birds. This is a native species to the South, folks, so get yours before the Yankees, Midwesterners, or West Coasters discover it. Now, after 12 years at the Arboretum, this guy grew from a 3-quart pot to just 3 feet tall, so it won't get to the 15-foot dividing line between trees and shrubs anytime soon as the species go. Now this species is called Walter's viburnum or small viburnum, but the only thing small about the species are the leaves. This guy stays small in stature throughout your garden. Try it for your next foundational plant. Now while it thrives in the wild with wet feet, it does really well in cultivation with drier conditions once it's established. How do you know if your plant's established? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. When your plant is rooted in and doing well on its own, like our lions, get back, Daisy, down, Leo, then yours is likely established, typically after a growing season or so. Now, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this showstopper session with North Carolina State Introductions featuring Ralston's Hardy Viburnum and Bailey Circus. And now for the clowns.
Mark, thank you very much. We appreciate that profile, plant profile. Next up is Dr. Matt Bertone. Matt is our entomology expert and is going to be talking about what's happening in the world of insects. Matt.
Well, I guess I got to be funny now, huh?
It's a tough act to follow, for sure.
All righty. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about two different subjects mainly, and then we'll talk about some things to look out for in the next few months. So, I don't know how many of you were with us last year at the beginning of the year, but I talked about magnificent myriapods, and specifically centipedes. But just for a refresher, this is a major lineage of arthropods. They're known for their long bodies with many legs. And they're actually the oldest land animals known. There's a millipede known from 428 million years ago. And about 300 million years ago, there was an 8-foot-long myriapod, Arthropleura. Now, like I said, there were 4 major groups: millipedes, centipedes, symphylans, and pauropods. We went over centipedes last time. Symphylans are a soil centipede that are sometimes called garden or greenhouse centipedes. They're white. They can sometimes become pests, but not very commonly. And then pauropods are a very obscure, small, white, soil-dwelling group. But today, I'd like to talk to you about the largest group, and these are the millipedes. Millipedes are very common outdoors, around homes and gardens. They're in the class Diplopoda, and that just basically means 2 legs. And this is because each of them has 2 legs per segment, and this is going to be unlike the centipedes that have one pair of legs per segment. These generally feed on detritus, fungi, rotting materials. They are occasionally feeding on live plants, but very rarely is that going to happen. If you see them, they're likely in the soil, feeding on kind of rotting leaves, things like that. You will find them sometimes in compost bins, and basically all around where it's moist. Now they're generally slow-moving, so they're not very fast. They're kind of slow-moving herbivores or detritus feeders. And they're actually extremely diverse. There are about 10,000 species in the world, and we have almost 1,000 species described in North America. And one of the interesting things is this specimen right here that I photographed came in on a sample from North Carolina, and apparently our local expert, who is actually a world expert, Roland Shelley at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, did not recognize it, which means it's probably a new species or even new genus. So there's still plenty of them to be found and studied. But a little bit more about millipedes. So their life cycle, they are sexual species. They have males and females, and they're very interesting. So the centipedes, they lay a sperm packet and the female picks it up. But in millipedes, they actually mate directly. So the male has these special organs right here on the 7th segment, and the female has these special organs on the 2nd segment. And basically they mate, he transfers a sperm, and she then becomes fertilized. When the time is right, the females will lay eggs singly or in groups. And some groups, like some of these polydesmids that I'll talk about in a few minutes, will actually make a little mud chamber for their eggs. Now, one of the really interesting things about millipedes, and one of the things that made me really want to talk about this time, is that I saw a photo online on my Facebook of these weird little critters that somebody was wondering, even a friend of mine who was really good at identifying, who didn't even know what they were. And so I knew right away, I think they're millipedes, baby millipedes. And they do look like insects because when millipedes are born or hatch out of their eggs, they have 6 legs only. So they could be mistaken for small springtails or things like that. Now they grow through at least 6 molts. And as you see here, this is a juvenile Narcissus millipede. And they basically, after they molt, they add segments on the end right before the tail, right before the tip of the abdomen or tip of the body. Now they add segments at this penultimate one, and they rarely molt after they're sexually mature. So millipedes come in all different shapes and sizes and varieties. We actually have a very good diversity of millipedes in the U.S., especially in the Appalachians. And so if you're out in western North Carolina, you may be in one of the hot spots in the world for millipede diversity. So a couple of kinds of millipedes I'll go over. So the first are really one of my favorites. These are in a separate group from almost every millipede you're going to find. These are the polyzenid, or the bristle millipedes. I feel like I've heard them called duff millipedes. But basically, they are very tiny, at most about 4 millimeters long, usually found in the soil or under bark. And they're covered in these hairs. And they might remind you of some other arthropod. They look a lot like dermestid larvae. But if you were to flip one over, you're going to find that they're going to have multiple legs down their body. Now, they use these hairs, these barbed hairs, to basically protect themselves. If an ant or something tries to catch it, it'll get a mouthful of these barbs, and it's very annoying, and they basically run away. And so these millipedes are very well protected that way. But they're very cute, very tiny millipedes. You may encounter them if you're digging in the soil or if you're overturning logs or something, creating a garden. And you may be wondering what it is, and that's actually a very tiny, strange little millipede. Okay, the Julida, these are all orders, just like the orders Coleoptera and Diptera and things like that, and insects, the flies and beetles. Millipedes, although they look similar, are in different orders. So the Julids are kind of the smallish, round millipedes. If you were to take a cross-section of this millipede, you'd see it was round. Now, not all the members of this order are very small, but the ones we have around here, typically under rocks and under stones, are going to be fairly small. Now, larger round millipedes are probably going to be in the order Spirobolida, and these are actually the very large, some of our largest local millipedes, especially this genus Narcissus. These are the big ones. They can contain several inches long, 4 or 5 inches. And they actually are pretty interesting. They're pretty nice millipedes. You can actually keep them as pets if you want. They're harmless to humans. You can hold them just like the pet millipedes that they sell in pet stores. But, you know, if you want to know more about that, you can always ask me later. And now the most diverse group. These are the most common millipedes you're going to find. These are the Polydesmida, or called flat-backed millipedes. They're very easily recognized from most groups of millipedes you'll see because they have these little wings on each segment, and these are called paranoda. Now there are lots of different types of these millipedes. Some are very colorful, like this Zysodesmid, and some are not as colorful, brownish, like this granulate millipede. Zysodesmid, some of these very colorful ones, these black and yellow ones, or black and red, are warning that they contain cyanide compounds in them. Now, they're not going to hurt you if you touch them, even if you were to eat them, which I hope you won't. They wouldn't hurt you, but they actually have a very pleasant almond smell. But this is actually to the smell of these cyanide compounds that can actually ward off predators like reptiles and birds and things like that. So they will openly walk around on the ground because they're not really too scared of being eaten. Now I have to mention one species in particular of polydesmid that you're almost certainly going to see, and that is the greenhouse millipede, Oxydus gracilis. Like I said, this is a polydesmid, so they do have these paranoda, these side flanges kind of on the body. And the best way to identify this species is that it's about 1 inch long, it's brown, and no other millipede around here will have this transverse line across each segment, this little groove in each segment. These are extremely common around gardens, around homes, under bricks, basically everywhere. Roland Shelley, the expert again, said that he thinks this is probably one of the most common organisms on Earth, basically, because you can find them everywhere. They are exotic, probably from Asia, but they've been here for very long, and they're basically very established. And like I said, very common. Now, millipedes and yew. So typically they live in these moist environments, so when you do get them indoors, you almost always see them dried and curled up and dead. That's because they can't survive in the low humidity of our homes. Now, if you have a basement that's got some humidity, you may find living millipedes all over the place. It's not really a concern, they're more of a nuisance. They are a nuisance also when sometimes when there's a lot of rain, it saturates the soil and basically drives these millipedes out of the soil. I've also seen in an apartment complex I lived in, we had a lot of millipedes in our apartment that was in the 2nd floor, and it was coincidental with spraying outside right around the building. And so if you spray pesticides, this may also drive these millipedes out of their natural habitat and onto homes, into homes. One of the things that people complain a lot about is that they sometimes smell bad. If you were to pick up one of these millipedes alive and smell it, it does have a very musky, kind of funky odor. And this is probably the most nuisance that they are. They can be vacuumed up, but again, because of the smell, it sometimes deters people from doing that. But just collecting them into some soapy water and flushing them down your toilet or something like that can help get rid of them. But again, they're harmless. You can just pick them up. You can even just throw them outside if you don't want to kill them. Basically know that this is probably temporary, especially when you have a lot of rain. Okay, now just some millipede facts. So they never have 1,000 legs, despite what their name means, the name meaning 1,000-legger. At most, there's actually a species in California that has at most 750 legs, or 750 pairs of legs. But most around here have about 30 to 100 pairs of legs. Now the largest in the world are from Africa and can be over 1 foot long. You see this gentleman holding this. And they are actually, these African millipedes are often sold in the pet trade and make actually very nice pets. They're docile, they can't hurt you, they feel kind of fun when you're holding them, a little bit like Velcro walking around. And you can feed them veggies and very table scraps, vegetable table scraps, things like that, and they do well with that. Now many do have defensive chemicals. However, they're not dangerous to people. Now, if you're handling a millipede, which is completely fine, you kind of want to wash your hands afterward because some of these chemicals can irritate the eyes, so you don't want to rub your eyes afterward. But I do encourage people to kind of get out there and, especially children and things, handle them because they're really a nice animal to have a good experience with because they are, they're just not fast, they're not aggressive, they're not dangerous in any way. Now, one of the most interesting things I saw is that actually lemurs in Madagascar have found a species there that when they lick, they get a little buzz. And you can see this happy little lemur here. So again, maybe these chemicals can be used for interesting ways by other animals, but for the most part, you don't have to worry about these things unless you're eating them, which I hope you don't. Now just one last thing to wrap up, just a quick comparison to centipedes versus millipedes. So again, centipedes have 1 pair of legs per segment, whereas millipedes have these 2 pairs per segment. That's the best way to identify the difference. Also, the way I like to say it is that generally centipedes are very fast. Millipedes, on the other hand, because a lot of them are chemically defended, are generally slow. centipedes are venomous predators. They can actually, the larger ones can inflict a bite, and they can envenomate you, although again, they're not dangerous. They're not even as dangerous as hornets or bees. Millipedes, on the other hand, are not dangerous at all to humans, other than, like I said, maybe some eye irritation. Just washing your hands after you've handled them is a good idea. And they, of course, feed on detritus. They don't need a venom. They're feeding on a food source that is not going to get away from them or anything. Okay, so that's millipedes. If you're digging around your garden or you're moving rocks or you're moving logs, you are definitely going to come into contact with millipedes. Again, there's no harm in holding them. Make sure you wash your hands afterward, but otherwise they're a pretty fun organism to experience. If you're having issues with them, you have to really learn about the situation, whether there's some environmental conditions that are affecting where they're moving. Okay, and now for some boring things. Sorry. Or not, because these are actually wood-boring insects that I'm going to be talking about. So we talked last time about a situation where we had some borers in some landscape trees. And I wanted to mention just some ways to identify some different borers that you might find in the plants in your yard. So first, let's talk about primary wood-boring insects. We call these primary wood-boring insects because they attack healthy plants. They can be a primary pest. They can actually cause decline in an otherwise healthy plant. They are much less common, though, than secondary pests. Some groups of insects, like longhorns, it's probably less than 10% of the species that are primary pests. Or primary invaders. They may not even be pests if they're not attacking plants we don't really care about. Examples of these are some metallic wood borers in the family Bupressidae. So the best example of this is, of course, the emerald ash borer, which is of concern because it attacks healthy ash trees. And so we really, there's really little you can do to safeguard those trees against that pest, because it doesn't matter if it's stressed or not, you can have a healthy tree that's attacked by them. Some longhorn beetles will also do this. The azalea twig borer is one. There are some twig girdlers that will girdle the twigs and branches of living plants to actually make them dead. And then you've got, of course, the Asian longhorn beetle and a few others that will attack trees and are a very big concern because they're generalists and they attack healthy trees. Some bark and ambrosia beetles, the scolatine weevils, are also primary pests. For instance, the red bay ambrosia beetle will attack healthy trees and introduce laurel wilt fungus into it. And there's several others, the camphor shot beetle, and then you kind of get into a gray area like the granulate ambrosia beetle that may come in fairly early in a stressed plant, enough so that you wouldn't even know it was stressed. Now, the lepidopteran pests, the clearwing borers and carpenter worms, are all basically primary pests. So they will invade ostensibly healthy trees and woody ornamentals. Now, secondary wood-boring insects, they usually attack stressed, declining, or completely dead plants. They will sometimes push plants over the edge. They will further stress it out. And this is really why maintaining the site health, the soil health, and the general health of the plants around is the best way to avoid being pushed over the edge by these secondary invaders. These are, again, much more common than primary pests. Most insects will invade trees that are not doing well or completely dead. And the timing of infestation is difficult to determine. Like I said, there's a little gray area. Because these pests are coming in based on the smells from the trees, very rarely by how the tree looks. We are very visual animals, and so we see a tree and we think it's healthy, but that tree may be screaming out in pain through chemicals and things that it puts out in the air. And these insects home in on that and know that this plant is about to die, and it's a very good site for them to live in. And we may think that they were the cause, but really there was something else going on. All right, so a little bit about identifying some wood borers. So I'm going to focus on the three main groups of wood-boring insects. We've got Coleoptera, Lepidoptera, and Hymenoptera, the beetles, the moths and butterflies, mainly moths, and the Hymenoptera, the wasps and sawflies. So larvae are most likely to be collected. Once they emerge and leave as an adult, you're probably not going to find them unless you catch that little window where they're actually laying eggs in the wood. And so right here we see this is a horntail, an adult horntail wasp. This is a primitive type sawfly type wasp, but instead of feeding on herbaceous plant tissue like a lot of sawflies, these are actually wood-boring insects as larvae. Then here is actually the European lesser elm bark beetle, and these will attack elms and Zelkova. But well, you're going to be seeing the larvae, like I said. So first, Lepidoptera are going to be the easiest to identify because they have these false fleshy legs like other caterpillars that have hooks or crochets on each of them. They also have 6 simple eyes on their head arranged in kind of a crescent shape. If you see, say, gummy exudate from prunus species, especially because of the peach tree borers or some other groups like dogwoods, if you see some weeping wounds, it may be a sign that there's a moth caterpillar in there. Now, these are not always going to, and not usually going to kill plants. You may have a large, healthy prunus that will have some infesting, and once they're done, it heals over. But there is some concern about introducing pathogens, and also smaller plants, if they're completely girdled or the tunneling is done too extensively, it may kill the plants. The difficult thing about this, as we discussed last time, is that to actually identify this, you would have to cut down the plant and look under the bark in the wood, and this is a destructive form of sampling. So if you suspect you have one of these borers, just maintain and observe the health of the tree. If it seems to be doing well, you may want to catch the adults when they're laying eggs at certain times of the year. Knowing the species and the tree host is important. You can maybe spray the actually outside of the tree to catch the adults, but the timing has to be very good for that. Okay, now Hymenoptera, the wasps, the sawflies, these have vestigial thoracic legs, so it's a little difficult to see here, but they have these little tiny nubs, the little fleshy thoracic legs. They have no prolegs, so they won't have I know the external feeding sawflies look very much like caterpillars, and they have prolegs, but without crochets. These internal wood feeders are not going to have prolegs like caterpillars. They also lack eyes, as do most wasp larvae, especially when you get into the higher wasps, the paper wasps and bees and things like that, ants. Now, cericids, like I showed, those are the horntails. They have a spine on the tip of the abdomen. This is actually what becomes that little horntail in the adult as well. So you can identify that. These typically attack oaks and a variety of other plants. Some of the most famous ones are also the Syrinx noctilio, the Syrinx wood wasp that attack pines. They actually do attack healthy pines. And some of the things, the nematodes and other things they inject in the tree for their larvae can actually cause decline, and that's why you hear a lot about those wood wasps. Most of the other ones, though, are going to be found in stressed or dying trees. Now, Coleoptera, the beetles, are going to be the most common borers, and they come in very many forms. There are many types that live in the decaying wood, and there are lots of beetles that live in fully decayed wood, and then all the way up to very recently dead or dying trees. So really determining how long the tree has been dead can help you identify some of these groups. and also know if they were a major concern and what to look for in the future. So if you have small, about less than 3 or 4 millimeters, legless grubs right here, usually found with adults in the tunnels, these are most likely bark beetles or ambrosia beetles. Some of them, many of them are kind of in the gray area where the plants look a little healthy, but they start to invade. Others, like I said, the red band ambrosia beetle and a couple of the other ones are primary pests, whereas some actually wait until the tree is much more in the later stages of the wood has to be still hard, but it may not have any leaves on the tree, anything like that. Now another sign of scolatine weevils, these bark beetles, is sometimes the adults, when they're creating these chambers, they don't feed on the wood, they excavate it and push it out as these toothpicks, these sawdust toothpicks. So if you see these sawdust toothpicks on a branch or a tree, you know, first of all, you should probably be aware that it's most likely that the tree is stressed and that these beetles are invading, other than a few species, like I said. But know that these beetles are also contributing to stress to the tree. It's very difficult to control these when they're like that. They're boring straight into the inner wood, which then they seed usually with a fungus. And that's why they're called ambrosia beetles, because they call this an ambrosia fungus. They actually garden fungi for their larvae to eat. They're not actually eating the wood. They're very difficult to control at this stage, but again, keeping your plants healthy, making sure they're disease-free, the soil is in good condition, things like that is the best way to reduce the prevalence of these types of beetles. Now you have an elongate, flattened larva without legs and with a wide thorax. These are probably going to be, most likely going to be metallic wood borers or Bupressidae. Like I said, emerald ash borer is one of the primary pests that we know of that's very important to our plants, or to important pests of our plants, but most of them are going to be secondary. So if you peel off the bark of a standing dead tree, you may get these elongate, flattish beetle larvae. A very close-looking group are going to be these elongate, slightly flattened, not as flattened as Bupressids, larvae with small legs. There are actually legs right here, this little tiny pegs, or lacking legs. They usually don't have as wide of a thorax as the Bupressids, and they're not as flat, and these are the longhorn beetles, the Cerambycidae. Bupressids are often called flathead borers. That can kind of lead you to that distinction, whereas Cerambycidae are often called roundhead borers. And we'll see some of the results of that later. Like I said, some are primary, but many are secondary. Okay, say you have a small C-shaped grub-like larva, almost like a white grub, with well-developed thoracic legs and a small head. These are usually powder post beetles, Bostrichidae, Lichtidae, and Anobiidae. They're always secondary, and if you have these, they're either in your furniture indoors or in very dry wood. They are not going to come in real late stages of decay when it's kind of soft and wet, and they're not going to be there when the plant is still alive. They really need fairly dry wood. They will actually, they're called powder post beetles because they turn the wood into a very, very fine sawdust, which actually packs the tunnels. And so I've had samples come in of furniture legs that on the outside look very solid, but if you put any pressure on them, they snap and all this dust comes out. These are not usually going to be, these are not going to be affecting your plants outdoors, especially ones that you notice are still alive or have green leaves. Lastly, typical weevils, these are the Curculionidae except for the subfamily Scolatinae, which are those bark beetles, are usually larger. They're usually over 5 millimeters long. They lack legs on their thorax, which is also going to be the same as the bark beetles. And they also have these spiracles. If you look under the microscope, these little holes, air holes in the side of the body, Weevils, if you're not sure, weevils often have this little bifurcate, almost Y-shaped spiracle. The technical name for that is biforous. These are sometimes primary, but often secondary, and it's not a great diversity. The bark beetles are much more diverse than the typical weevils as far as wood-boring insects. Although there are some weevils that will bore into herbaceous plants. There's a few species that bore into asters, like sunflower stems, things like that. And so they're extremely diverse. Weevils are one of the largest families of insects on Earth, and so they do a lot of things. Basically all are herbivorous. Last time we mentioned one of the common ones is the cypress weevil. You can see again, fairly large. This one is close to a centimeter or so, or a little over a centimeter. No legs anywhere, no prolegs, no real legs. A nicely well-defined head capsule. And if you were to look at these little spiracles right here, you'd see that they had bifurcation or a little Y shape. Now the last thing is that once the insects are gone, of course, that may be a good thing, but you still want to maybe know what was attacking your plants. Or if you see these holes in the plants, you may want to know what made it. So under the bark, there are going to be galleries and tunnels are different between different species and families. So if you pull off the bark and see a very zigzag shape all throughout the bark, that's probably a metallic wood borer, and emerald ash borer would make this type of thing. If you see a weird, basically a central line, vertical line with little squiggles coming out the sides, that's probably a bark beetle. But they make various types of galleries and tunnels, either right under the bark or into the heartwood of the plant. However, when they do emerge as an adult, they will often have different exit hole shapes. So for instance, the D-shaped, this flat bottom with the round top hole, is exclusively buprestids. And particularly that's for emerald ash borer signs, that's one of the things people look for, is the D-shaped, small D-shaped exit hole. Now if there's a round or flattened kind of oval hole, that's going to be many cerambycids or longhorns and some buprestids. And finally, if you have a fairly spherical hole or very, very round-looking hole of various sizes, of course, all these exit holes can be size dependent on the species. But if you have a round hole, it's going to be mostly curculionids, most weevils, most longhorns, and then also the moths and wasps. It's basically the general hole. They're going to come out of a round one. So these are kind of some ways that after they've exited that you may be able to identify what the culprit was before, although that may be moot by that time. Okay, so finally, I just want to give some heads up on be on the lookouts for May and June. So tent caterpillars are going to be coming out, be making webs in the crotches of trees. This will distinguish them from the later season fall webworms. And you'll see these larvae walking around all over the place, but be on the lookout for them. You'll see the witch hazel gall aphids, the cone aphids, are probably pretty well developed or are just about there right now. You'll see a lot of slugs out. I went out at night to look at my porch light for some insects the other night, and there were tons of slugs all over my patio. So they're going to be out and about and munching on leaves and things like that, to the dismay of most gardeners. Also, you're going to have swarming termites coming out now, so it's getting to be a little late for the eastern subterranean termite, Reticulotermes flavipes, but we're going to be starting getting into the Reticulotermes virginicus season now. So if you see these swarmers, you know that there's some termite activity. If you see it outdoors, that's fine. If you see it indoors, that's not a good sign, and you should probably get somebody to come look at that. Lastly, you're going to see a lot of scales, aphids, and hoppers kind of ramping up their activity, which means you're going to have a lot of honeydew raining down. If you've parked your car under a tree right now, you probably have lots of little sugar marks all over your car, little sticky spots. That's the honeydew raining down. You may even see it through the sunlight coming down from the trees. And of course, because it's getting warm out now, you're going to be seeing many, many, many more insects. Basically, this is going to start to be peak season soon for the late spring, early summer. All right, and if there are any questions, maybe you want to save them for later or not.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions? Did you? Okay, here's one from Gina. Has scale been worse this year? Seems like several people worried about big trees covered with scale.
Yes, I've gotten a lot of calls and we've gotten a lot of contacts about the scales. I don't know exactly why they may be worse this year, but a lot of people are concerned with them. Typically, if it's a mature tree, and a lot of the people are concerned with the oak licanium scale, these big brown, shiny kind of nodules all over the stem, the twigs. If it's a mature tree, it will likely not be affected. If it's a smaller tree, you really want to get some control and basically using some kind of systemic insecticide on those plants, or if you can, trying to just wipe down some of the branches if you have, say, a sapling, and just remove a lot of those eggs and crawlers and things like that. But they are bad. I don't know exactly the reason why this year is particularly bad compared to last year. Maybe more people are tuned to it and notice them. But we do have these cycles where one year is really bad for a certain pest, the next year is not. Okay. Okay, so somebody is mentioning something about spinosad for slugs and snails. I'm not, again, I'm the identifier. I don't know all the ins and outs of the control, so it may work. I'm not sure. I know that people do use beer, too, as a bait. Apparently slugs love it. Also, I think you can use some diatomaceous earth, which basically dries them out. All right. Any other questions before we turn it over to Mike? And yes, chickens love them.
Yeah. Tasty treat for your fish pond too. All right. Well, thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate all of the great information and the stunning photographs. Wow. Next up is Mike. Thank you. Welcome. Oh, we got a question before we switch off. Do carpenter bees feed on termites?
Do carpenter bees feed on termites? They do not. They feed on pollen and nectar, and just like other bees, they don't actually eat the wood. When you see, that's why you see all that sawdust coming out. They actually just excavate it, and typically the wood they like is much more sound than the wood that termites like. So they won't. They're likely never to come in contact, actually.
Thanks, Matt. All right, Mike, it's all yours.
Okay, welcome to the disease part. I don't know how to follow something as stunning as Matt's photographs and self-medicating lemurs and Mark's presentation, but we'll try by turning it over to you and asking questions of you for this last half hour. First question, if you can hear me, give me a green check, and if you cannot hear me, give me a red X. Okay, looks good. First question, I'm sorry, no, we're on the second question now. What is this fungus? Turns out that we had a person come to the door with this problem yesterday, and then we had an email about it this morning. It was something that we weren't going to talk about today, but it got included just because there was so much interest. So, if, excuse me, I see that Lee J has already moved us to the ABCD polling. If you go under where that green check was that you gave before, it has now turned to a letter. So choose the letter of the response that you think is correct. Is this fungus downy mildew, entomosporium, powdery mildew, or sooty mold? And we have, let's see, how many total people logged on? It looks like 60 folks are logged in. And we've gotten about half of that number of responses. So give another second or two here. All right, second is over. And we can see that the majority of the responses are in fact correct. This is sooty mold. As we have talked about in the past, I believe on this program, the way to get a sooty mold diagnosis, if you see this sort of patchy, sometimes covering an entire leaf or leaflet, fungal growth, dark in color, all you have to do is rub it with your thumb. Sometimes it takes a little pressure, but if you can peel that off or rub it off and see the green color to the leaf underneath, you know that it's sooty mold, which is actually not parasitizing the leaf at all. It's growing on the honeydew from insects feeding higher up on that plant or else on plants that are growing over the top of it. So there's really no control needed to be directed against the fungus here, but there may, depending on the situation, be control to be directed at the insects. And of course, weather's going to have effect on this too. A lot of rain, this may tend to wash off and be less noticeable. But for whatever reason, we've got inquiries about these in the last couple of days and wanted to make sure to draw attention to sooty mold. Second question, what's wrong with this leyland? I'll give you the choices in a moment here. This is a sample that came in from Burke County this month, actually from a golf course, and you notice a lot of dead needles here. So I'm going to offer the choices of, is this a needle sign of armillaria root rot? Is this Passiflora needle blight? Is it a sign of Phytophthora root rot down below? Or is it a sign of Ceridium canker? And thank you for clearing off. I see that maybe I did that, cleared off the old choices, but we've got A, B, C, D again as possibilities. While people are doing this, just a little tidbit that I ran across yesterday about a woman in England who had a dispute with her neighbor for 24 years, and then in 2008 finally got a judgment by a local council that the neighbor had to lower the height of their leyland cypress hedge, which was 50 feet tall by that time, and they were ordered to lower it down to 40. And then the next year 30 feet, and she was happy because she would be able to garden again because sunlight would be reaching her yard. Okay, we've got 25 responses, still not quite half. I'll give another second or two. And once again, I wasn't able to trick very many people, maybe scared a few into not wanting to reply, but the majority have it correct. This is Passiflora needle blight. Now the question is, how did you know that? The way that I would distinguish these 4 diseases that were on the list there, I'll mention as we go. But first of all, the fungus has had different names. You may see in the literature and the older information, or even in some newer comments, some of the older names of the fungus. It's called Passiflora sequoiae now, which is my all-time favorite specific epithet in the scientific name world, because it has every vowel, I guess except Y. It's got A, E, I, O, and U all in there. And the sequoiae part is interesting because this is actually known on redwood among other hosts, and I'll show a list of those hosts later. But some of the older names are Cercospora sequoiae, Cercosporidium sequoiae, and Asperosporum sequoiae. This again is a close-up of that leyland from Burke County, and you can see that what's happening is individual leaves are being attacked. So go to our pointer here. So you can see lesions on individual needles here, and some are larger this way. But you don't have, as would you get with Ceridium, a point of girdling for example, here, and then have the entire twig dead from that point forward. Here is a typical case. This is on eastern red cedar, actually, from a couple of years ago, late in the year, in Northampton County. And you can see how it's working from the lower portions upward, and typically from the inside of the tree outward. This is a picture I've actually showed on Plants, Pests, and Pathogens before from Christy Breedenkamp, a hedge of leyland in Swain County, and pretty heavily infected with Passiflora needle blight in one particular section. And the close-up there, you can just barely start to see some of the little tufts of fruiting bodies here, which I'll show a further close-up of on this slide. This is actually from Monterey cypress here in Wake County. A student brought this in for a class at one point. And so we're highly magnified. This is one needle here, and you can see these little tufts where the fungus is producing clusters of spores that will then become wind-borne and cause new infections. And it's when you see this that you have an opportunity for control if it is warranted. And by control in this case, we're talking about chemicals. It's not very often that we recommend chemical control on ornamentals in the landscape, but this is a case where it may be useful. It's a little bit of a complicated scenario. You don't have to remember all this, but the Ag Chem manual has it if you want to refer back. But basically, it's the only case that we've got that I know of in ornamental diseases where there's actually a scouting program to guide your chemical control measures. So you look where you've seen the problem before, and here it says mid-May, but now it's only late April and we've already got it. If you see those little tufts of olive green spores, then you know that you need to start your applications. The recommendation there is to make 2 applications of a systemic fungicide. Here read something with mycobutanil at 14-day intervals, and then come back after that with an application or 2 of one of the protectant fungicides at weekly intervals. Then you wait a few weeks, scout the trees again for new infections, and repeat with a shorter scheme of fungicide applications if you've seen new infections occurring. There really wouldn't be any confusion with Phytophthora armillaria root rots as causing that symptom that we saw. You'll notice when those are involved, Phytophthora here on the left and armillaria on the right. These, I think, were Sean Banks' pictures from a couple of years ago. In both cases, leyland cypress that have been established for 7 years. You'll notice that you get general loss of color, kind of a straw coloring to the foliage. Since the root system is compromised, it tends to be on large sections of the tree or the entire tree, and not individual needles being affected. It's probably more easily confused with Ceridium canker, but there it wouldn't be too hard once you get the idea that the Passiflora needle blight moves from the bottom up and inside out generally. Although you saw that picture from the golf course there were fairly new needles affected, but you also saw some of the very newest growth coming out green, as you can see on the Monterey cypress in the lower left picture. Ceridium canker on leyland or Italian cypress, those are the main hosts that we see it on, will cause the tips of the branches to die because of the girdling effect of the fungal infection. And these often take on an orangish cast once they die. There is no chemical control for Ceridium canker or other canker diseases. Here you just want to try and prune these out if it is feasible, if you can get to them. Go several inches into the clean twig so that you know that you've got ahead of the fungal infection. The Passiflora needle blight, as I mentioned before, occurs on not just leyland cypress, Monterey cypress that we've seen here, which is a cupressus species, eastern red cedar in one of the other photos, redwood, which gives it the name sequoia, and even on arborvitae. A couple more photographs of Ceridium canker. The old name was, well, it was Ceridium cupressi, although we had been calling it for a long time Ceridium unicorni. And the new name under the new rules is Leptotypa cupressi, but it's the same thing as Ceridium cupressi, which is a species that we believe we see here in the eastern United States. The photograph on the left is from Lee County. Agent who took that picture there, and in the sample when it came in turned out to have Ceridium. And then an example just from this month on some Italian cypress out in Carteret County, and you can notice the individual flagging dead tips here on that tree, which would be probably pretty impractical and dangerous if you were to try to prune it. Very occasionally Ceridium will get into, let's say, a main trunk or a larger branch. Mostly it's just the tips. Does regular shade, question coming in here, does regular shade on lower and northern sides of host plants play a significant role in susceptibility of needles to needle-infecting diseases? Not that I am aware of. It does, of course, tend to cause the plant to cut its losses if the needles are so shaded that they would be not contributing to the photosynthesis of the plant and then eventually be shed. Now, if that shade, though, is resulting in extra humidity, then that is quite possible. So you'll notice, like with the Passiflora here, the lower and inner foliage tending to be affected first. Similar pattern you might see on Rhizosphaera needlecast on spruces up in the mountains. Here I don't have a list of ABC choices, but if anyone would like to offer an idea of what this is, now the host is arborvitae, you'll notice general off color and some needles dying on the older foliage, with the very newest growth coming out looking pretty good. So if anybody has a guess or knows what this is, please type it onto the white box itself. There should be a tool for entering text on the page, and you can just click on that and type it in as, for example, here. That was one of our old standby diagnoses back in the day, micrometeorites. Like you see, some people have typed into the chat box, which is fine also. Cold injury, winter injury, some sort of rust. Actually, we don't see rust on arborvitae. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that.
Nor micrometeorites.
No, it's actually none of those. No micrometeorites either. Well, I can't rule out those 100%, but it looks more likely, once you get it under higher magnification, that this is old spider mite damage. Now this would have been,
yes,
what, the spruce spider mite? It would have been active in the colder months, and so that's why the new foliage looks okay.
Yeah, most likely. On conifers, it's going to be spruce spider mite. If you do find eggs especially, they're going to be red eggs with a little hair-like wisp coming off the top, but oftentimes by the time you've seen the damage, you may not find any mites at all. Like we did in this sample, it was just shed skins and eggshells and things like that.
All right. Moving along, next question for you folks. Do you know this particular problem on, in this case, azalea? This picture was from a plant in front of my sister-in-law's place last May, but we did get an inquiry about this on email this month already. And azalea leaf gall, azalea leaf gall. It is in fact azalea. It does have a leaf gall. Anybody want to offer the name of what's causing it? All right. It is a fungus called Exobasidium. So it's actually more related to, let's say, the mushrooms than it would be to the Pastelora-type needle blight or some of the other things that we often see on foliage. Although who knows with the new molecular phylogenies where these have ended up. But it is a basidiomycete. It produces its spores right on the surface of that gall. And on azalea, it's kind of interesting in this particular case, if you flip that leaf over, you saw that these are not solid, that they're hollow chambers created by the bubbling out of the epidermis of the leaf. And we often also see this on camellia, different species of Exobasidium that will get on camellia. In fact, there may be more than one on that. Notice this is in an early stage, so the spore is just being produced in the whitish area here on the underside of the gall before secondary, darker molds start colonizing it, which even makes it look worse. These are cosmetic problems. They're not going to affect the long-term health of the plant. They only have one cycle per year, so once they've developed like this, they won't produce new ones. You can prune those out, preferably before you get the spores produced and starting a new cycle of infection. But those spores will either before or after germination hang out in or on the buds until next spring when the new growth begins. Yeah, Tom, I would still say that this is the recommended treatment to prune these out. There are a couple of things that are mentioned in the NC Ag Chemicals manual for this, but that would be if you had a commercial applicator, because I don't think any of them are homeowner available products. And also only if it was very unsightly and you had a significant recurring problem. Moving forward here, I want to do some of our bolos, or are looking to the upcoming months in the form of a quiz. So what do we have here? Those who've been on the program in the past should recognize this. This is one of the most dramatic photographs that I've ever seen of this problem by our own Dr. Dave Ritchie in our department at his home in Durham. It's now getting on, 7 years ago. Sean says rust. Anybody else? Want to be more specific, Sean? Which rust? Yeah, rust cedar. Okay, cedar quince rust. It is not cedar apple rust. In fact, it is cedar quince rust, or just quince rust. At least that's appears to be what the fungus is. It alternates with cedar trees like cedar apple rust does, but in this case it produces very dramatic effects both on the fruits and on the young stems, as you can see here, of ornamental pear. The one on Amelanchier, I've never been able to figure out what species that is, but it'll be in the same genus, one of the Gymnosporangium rusts. I didn't put it in the name here on this slide, but it's Gymnosporangium clavipes is the name of the fungus. And I think I may have mentioned, oh no, I don't think I mentioned to this group the callers last year who had this on their trees, and it was one of those cases where I was talking to the husband. He was relaying the information to the wife, who apparently had the greater concern, and one of their questions was whether their tree was the villain or the victim in this case. I don't know, they were worried about neighbors and what they would think. And I said, well, have you got any junipers? And they said no, and I said, well, then you're the victim. Turf. We'll say that this is a cool season turf grass heading into warm weather, looking ahead to, yep, bingo, brown patch. You would notice that by the brown patches, also the fact that it's a cool season turf in warm weather, and the very distinct lesions on the individual blades if you get down and examine them. And I believe this is the last one for the Bolo quiz. Oh, no, it's not. I've actually got a couple more. Rose bushes. We've got some of the new growth retaining a red color instead of starting out red and then becoming green. We've also got some witch's brooms going on here. And rose rosette virus, yes it is. Notice though that you don't always get this hyperthorniness. If you see that, then you've got absolutely confirmed that you've got rose rosette. If you've got some of these others, like the witch's broom, sometimes witch's brooms are caused by herbicide exposure, glyphosate exposure, but you wouldn't get this persistent reddening of the stems as you do with rose rosette. Staying with roses, see, we're getting close to out of time here, so let me just jump to the conclusion here. These are 3 different spots on rose leaves. The first is downy mildew, which you won't see in the landscape really. This is a production problem. Haven't seen much of it lately. The middle one is black spot, which if you don't have a resistant variety, you are going to have with the black spots with the feathered edges, some chlorosis and leaf drop, and Cercospora leaf spot, which is a little bit different shape and, border and color. Just to remind folks that powdery mildew and downy mildew are very different. Here on rose you can see the great difference in the symptoms, and then these would be the signs of the pathogen, the actual sporulation of the fungus on the rose leaves. Rose, of course, euonymus, Gerbera daisy, spirea, dogwood. Later on in the season on squash and pumpkin in the vegetable garden we will see powdery mildew. Very, very quickly, powdery mildew management as we get into that season. The dormant pruning, if you've had it on woody plant parts, rose canes for example, can be of benefit, or so they say. Not over-fertilizing. That actually kind of harks back to something that Jeanine talked about in her organic gardening message, because that fresh, succulent foliage is very attractive to the powdery mildew fungus, or very favorable to it. Host resistance, finding resistant varieties, cultivars, and species is definitely the way to go, and you may need to use fungicides. The good news on that is there are a lot of active ingredients. The bad news is that the fungus tends to become, or the fungi tend to become, insensitive or resistant to those fungicides after repeated use, and that you would have to be applying them on a fairly frequent interval to stay ahead of the fungus, 7 to 14 days depending on the product. Sometimes it's just not worth it. Landscape trees, they're not really doing much damage, and it's going to be hard to treat anyway. In a few cases, maybe susceptible cultivars, rose, phlox, zinnia, in the landscape you would have benefit from using some fungicides, and in some cases it's not worth it because you're never going to win on something like a euonymus. It's just too susceptible. The fungicides that traditionally we would recommend for powdery mildew would be some of the DMIs, mycloputanyl and tebuconazole, being available in a couple different brands to the homeowner. Strobilurins, I don't know that there are any labeled for homeowner use at this point for non-turf applications. I could be wrong. I have to go and check on that. And if you're going the biorational approach, the greener approach, potassium bicarbonate, neem oil, which I saw is available in a consumer preparation, or some of the petroleum oils can also be used. If disease pressure is low, they may give an acceptable level of control. Finishing out our bolos for May and June, fruits may or may not, hit or miss kind of thing. See some peach leaf curl. Peach scab, though, is going to become very coming on the scene. It's one of our top 2 diseases on peach fruit in the home orchard, and that first month after shuck split is when the most important infections occur. We may be seeing some fire blight on apple and pear as well in this season. Veggies, we'll be getting bacterial spot of tomato and pepper, as well as septoria leaf spot on tomato. We'll be talking about veggies more in our June program. Root knot nematode, keep an eye on your cucurbits, your beans, maybe later on the tomatoes, beets as well as possible hosts for root knot nematode. And then starting, not yet, but from late May onward, we want to be aware of downy mildew of cucurbits moving in and southern bacterial wilts. Very different diseases. Downy mildew has to come in every year afresh because it doesn't survive our relatively cold winters where southern bacteria will overwinter in the soil and cause problems in the same spot year after year. usablight.org, I think Jeanine made reference to some of these too. That's a site where you can keep track of the late blight situation in the country. Nothing particularly hot right at the moment. And there's the IPM pipe site for downy mildew. This is a downy mildew of cucurbits. And there was a report this past month in the very southern part of Georgia. So when will it arrive in North Carolina? We don't know. But eventually the winds, or hopefully not transplants, will bring it here. Finally, our ornamental bolo, be on the lookout for black spotted rose, Phytophthora root rot, powdery mildew as mentioned, oak leaf blister, pictured here on the right, quince rust and ornamental pear, which we saw, leaf spots and anthracnosis on maple, and rose rosette. In turf grasses, winter due to warm season grasses, large patch of warm season grasses, brown patch of tall fescue, and rust could pop up on zoysia or Kentucky bluegrass, and I think there's some other species as well. I see I'm a minute over, but if anybody has a quick question. All right, back to you, Lucy.
Okay, well that's why it's exciting to live in North Carolina, because there's so many things going on. Our next Plants, Pests, and Pathogens will be on June 23rd. We're always the fourth Tuesday every other month, except when we get snowed out. So the information on the gardening portal gives you all the general information about plants, pests, and pathogens. You can go there to see what the schedule and speaker lineup and everything that is public. If you go to ncsugarden.com, that's where you'll get the links, because the live session is only available to Extension Master Gardeners and Extension professionals, whereas the recordings are available to the public. So we're going to close out the official part of the session in just a second, and then after that we'll go back over the announcements that were done ahead of time. If you didn't log on in time to see all the announcements, you're welcome to stay for that part. If you've already seen it, you don't need to do that. So Mike, cue the music. Okay, so a couple of quick announcements for you. We have the grand launch of the Extension Gardener Handbook is going to be this Friday at 10 o'clock. Join us for a webinar. We're going to go over the overall organization and structure, how to use the site, because the first phase of it is a live public website. So I hope you can join us to be the first people to see that. If you're not already subscribed to the Extension Master Gardener list, please do. That's where the links to the different events and activities get emailed to that group. So if you just go to go.ncsu.edu/subscribe-emgv-listserv, then that'll let you subscribe and you'll get messages that go out statewide to Extension Master Gardener volunteers. If you haven't gotten your license plate yet, please do. This is a great way for us to publicize the program, so it's great PR, and it's also a fundraiser for the Extension Master Gardener Endowment. So $10 out of every $20 spent on a specialized license plate goes straight to the endowment. So thank you to all of you guys who have already gotten one. Extension Master Gardener Conference is coming up. It's going to be September 21st through the 22nd. In the Raleigh-Durham area at Embassy Suites. It's very near the Raleigh-Durham airport. And that will be followed immediately by an agent training session. More information on both of these when you go to ncsugarden.com. We are headed to Costa Rica in February, and you can get more information about that online. We'll have the actual dates and prices should be up soon. Very excited that we have new Extension Master Gardener Volunteer State Coordinator Lisa Sanderson starts on May 11th. She's going to be a great addition to our team. She's actually got her bachelor's degree and her master's degree at NC State, a bachelor's in horticulture science and a master's in ag education. She's worked as a high school teacher, a landscape designer, and she's been an extension agent in Virginia. So she brings a lot of great experience to the position. We have this position because Extension Director Joe Zablina and Tom Melton, Sherry Schwab, and John Dole all were part of making it possible. So it'd be great to thank them because many, many programs across the state are being cut, and we were given a full-time position. So kudos to you for making that possible, and they would be the ones to thank. Got a great new program coming out of Durham, Getting Dirty, on the radio with Extension Master Gardener volunteers. Lise Jenkins is the point person. She's the producer, but there's a lot of great people who are involved in making this happen. It's a radio show that's also set up as a podcast and has a website, and we'll show you all those things. But they're looking at regional stories, the intersection of horticulture, innovation, and people. This is a look at part of their website. Theirs is the only one in the country that we know of that Master Gardeners are producing. If you want to get involved, you can contact Michelle Wallace, who's the county agent in Durham County, or Lise Jenkins, the show producer. They're very interested in having reporters in other areas and capturing stories from across the state. This is the website address, gettingdirtyradioshow.org, and a screenshot from the site. So they started last June. They've been on there for about a year, and they began podcasting in January. So there's lots of shows queued up you can go back and see. And here's links to their website, their Twitter site, and their Facebook site. I had trouble finding it on Facebook using this title. So if you go to the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener Facebook page and look at who they're friends with, it may be easier to get there by clicking on a link than by using the Facebook search. Whole series of webinars the week of May 18th about how to better use the tools that are available to us through the Extension Master Gardener intranet. So on May 18th, that will be a general overview of the whole system, and all Master Gardeners and Extension staff are welcome to come learn what are all those tools and how best to use them. On May 19th, we'll be focusing on page editors, so how to edit the content, upload images, and to work with the site. And on May 20th, the workshop will be for super admins, who are the folks in your county who are managing all of the content. So hope you can join us. All of these are posted on the statewide Extension Master Gardener calendar. So if you go to log in on your page and you go up to, if you go up to statewide, this button up here on the top, then that'll take you to this area where you have a green background. And if you click on the calendar there, you'll see links to all of the events that are being announced statewide. We have a new capacity to subscribe to the portals, which is really exciting. It's a little tricky, so I want to explain to you how that works. What this does is it allows you to get an announcement anytime new information is posted to the portal. So you can set up to get an email once a week that tells you what are the new things that are posted. And I think you can also have it each time it's posted. I think you can choose how much you get. But to subscribe to it, you need to go to the portal. So for this example, it would be gardening.ces.ncsu.edu. And then you have to click on a news item. So you click on a news item and it opens up this window over here. And at the bottom of that, there's a thing that says subscribe by email. So you have to type your email address in at this point in order to get on to the list. Here's a list of upcoming events. We've got a lot of things happening for Extension Master Gardeners. May 1st is the introduction to the Extension Master Gardener Manual, or Extension Gardener Manual. Lisa Sanderson starts the webinar series. On July 15th through the 18th is the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference. Outstanding conference, recognized nationally and hosted right here in Cullowhee. So strongly encourage you to look at that. Our conference is the 21st to the 22nd, and the International Master Gardener Conference is coming up too. So all of those are great opportunities. So that's all the news. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for being here today.